there's a little bit of a delay between where we are and where the live stream is. I would say it's 20 to 30 seconds. So
we're right now we're just quickly checking if we can see ourselves, and then.
Yep. Okay, I can see it. Do you want to check if you can hear it?
Oh, so I should go to. Oh, could you? I can totally check. Just could you Slack me the YouTube link real quick?
Yeah, of course. For anyone who is tuning in, who doesn't know, that would be everybody. Everyone would know the YouTube link. There we go. So we didn't announce this one widely before we got started because it's the first time we've tried this particular setup, and it is a little complex. And I hope I've done a good job.
Yeah, okay, I can hear myself, so it's
great. It's you that I was worried about.
No, that seems to work.
All right, welcome to paper reading. So we actually started this paper 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, something like that.
We were just sort of like kicking the tires, see if it worked. And the paper is Language Models Are Few-Shot Learners by Brown Italia from OpenAI, and we got not that far. So I thought this was going to be like an ACL long paper, which is, I believe, 15 pages, and it is significantly more than that. So just to quickly review what we did last time, and sort of like what the model is and what it does, and some things that we were surprised about. And then they have a section on broader impacts. And I was hoping that we could focus on this section today because I think, that seems like about as many pages that I can expect to read in an hour. 1 second, let me make sure I have the chat up so I can see what folks are saying.
And I also think it's fair, like, usually fairness and bias and representation, these are things that are usually underrepresented, I think. And especially because this is a substantially huge model, the energy usage is bound to not be zero either. So I think it is definitely valid to just have a start there. Like, I think it's also because it's non-standard.
Yes, definitely. And also relevant that I don't know that they're going to talk about in this paper because the paper was published before they announced it, but they're launching a closed beta API access to this model and also other models that they're using, which is, is going to make this a lot more accessible for good or ill.
So it depends on what they like. I can imagine that they check who to allow, of course. But this is GPT-2, right? I think there was also a 3, I suppose. So this is
3.
Oh, this is 3. Okay, so
this paper is 3. Yeah.
Okay. Just to make sure, because there were multiple versions of it, and this is the most recent one. Then. Okay.
Yeah, this is the big one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, just to like quickly review what we've done so far, it's basically exactly the same as GPT-2, but much bigger. And their sort of like big contribution is the way that they are doing transfer learning from this really big language model, which is sort of like it's not a explicit statistical model, but it's sort of a generalization of what words tend to follow each other in their corpus, which is, as I remember, open crawl. Does that sound right?
I do remember that, but I think there's also other data sets that are using. But open crawl definitely, I recall being in here.
Which, worryingly, they could not guarantee did not conclude the test data, because of course open call is a big call to web space. I don't know. And a lot of the data sets that they're evaluating are open and are available online. So definite possible contamination there, which they mentioned. And
just to be explicit, contamination of?
Yeah. Oh, so seeing the testing data in the training data.
Like information leaking, that sort of thing, right?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, leakage.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm not saying that like the data's radioactive or anything.
No, but I mean, you also have contamination in the fairness and bias sense, so to say. That's also a valid
Mm-hmm.
concern. But just to be explicit, this is more about the information leakage.
Yes.
And I recall reading something along the lines of when we discovered it, we already spent a lot of money and couldn't retrain the whole thing just like that. So,
I'm seeing the number 21 million, and I don't know if I made that up or that's actually how much it cost to train the model, but it was
It's substantial.
not cheap.
This is a substantially expensive model.
Mm-hmm. And then the way that they're evaluating the model is they call it zero-shot learning, and basically they take the model, which does language generation, and they give it a sort of like seed snippet. So if you want to, I'm trying to think of one of the tasks they did. So like they did math. They did like arithmetic. So it would be like 1 + 1 equals, and then the model will finish the quote unquote sentence with 2, which is not a standard NLP evaluation task, and weird. It's a weird thing to do.
Yeah, and I think the last time we concluded with the idea, like, you could argue that because it's a non-standard task, maybe that's also why it's something that you could mention, because it's something it really has to generalize from. And if I recall looking at the appendix with you, and then at the end we saw that, hey, especially on the math challenge, you notice that when you add the millions of billions of parameters, that's when suddenly you get the upswing. That's when suddenly the model starts performing better on that task. And the appendix was huge. That's also something I remember from last time. So there are definitely some non-standard things in here, and definitely this is a huge model. That's definitely the impression that we had.
No, definitely real big. I'm just asking in the chat about the audio quality because that's what I'm most worried about.
Okay.
Yeah, big model. And I guess thinking about a lot of the criticisms of these big language models, the fact that they don't have, a knowledge model and can't do, reasoning that we would expect a human to, and that includes like, I have 5 apples, I give 1 to Jeannie, how many apples does Jeannie have, sort of problems, is something that a lot of people have brought up. I think particularly Gary Marcus, I think, has gone to town on this particular line of argumentation.
I suppose, so my main thing with this is it's inherently hard to reproduce. That's also the tricky thing with this. And I get that you want to push the state of the art forward, and there's an engineering challenge, and there's reasons why this is still definitely something that's valid to publish about. But the non-reproducibility of it is a downside for industrial applications as well.
It is real big. All right, so let's jump into this broader impact section.
Yes.
And just read through it. Digital Breed says the audio quality is very low.
Low as in low volume, or low as in very hard to hear?
Yeah.
Because I did notice that my voice was soft. That's soft as in not loud.
I'm asking in the chat. Let's see if we can fix this.
Yeah, so...
Are you listening to the video, Vincent?
Just very, very briefly. Also, I just want to mention, this is the first time I'm doing this live over YouTube ever. So this is all a new experience to me.
Also, you can't see me.
That's
which I don't know if people know.
Yeah, that's true. Something with the setup, I suppose. But if
voice is slightly ahead of the video. I don't know if I can fix that. So I'm thinking about if I can fix that. Hard to hear. Let me turn up the gain.
Yeah, so I could definitely hear myself way clearer over the Zoom call, but mainly it's louder. Like, that's the thing. It's the audio quality seems fine. It's just a little bit soft.
Okay. That should hopefully be better. It should be much louder. All right. Thank you. Please keep checking in with us again. This is much more technically complex than when it's just me. All right. Okay. Section 6. Broader impacts.
Yes.
Do you want to kick us off?
Sure.
So I can drink coffee?
You've been setting everything up, sure. Okay, so it says that language models have a wide range of beneficial applications for society, including code and writing auto-completion. Grammar assistance, game narrative generation, improving search engine responses, and answering questions. but they also have potentially harmful applications. And GPT-3 improves the quality of text generation and adaptability over smaller models and increases the difficulty of distinguishing synthetic text from human written text. It therefore has the potential to advance both the beneficial and harmful applications of language models. So far, I would argue if you have a very good model, all of this sounds true. I don't know.
Ooh, I'm not comfortable with code generation.
I'm assuming that when we say code generation, that
they do say auto completion, which I think could be helpful, but my biggest concerns there are conspiracy, security concerns, because almost always people are training on like public GitHub data. So the potential that somebody could like seed GitHub with malicious but like okay looking code that introduces security vulnerabilities is very high.
Yeah.
Also potential like secret key discovery.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, there's a risk that if you generate source code that looks reliable but it accidentally gets merged, like the whole node thing that happened a while ago.
Yes.
It's certainly true. But I do think like the statement they make here in general, if you have a very, very useful model, it can be used for both good and bad, and that's something to consider. I think the general gist of it there is, I think, accurate.
That's fair.
There might certainly be a couple of examples that they mentioned where you can wonder, well, how much good is there compared to the bad? That's definitely also fair. But having said that, I think so far so good. Then
I agree. There are lots of applications.
Yeah, so and especially if you're in video games, I guess like that's to me I suppose the obvious one. But there we go. Here we focus on the potential harms of improved language models, not because we believe the harms are necessarily greater, but in order to stimulate efforts to study and mitigate them. The broader impacts of language models like this are numerous. We focus on two primary issues. First one being the potential for deliberate misuse of language models like GPT-3 in section 6.1, and issues of bias, fairness, and reputations within models like GPT-3 in section 6.2. And then briefly, they will also mention issues of energy efficiency. Okay. So
I'd say those
split up in 3 segments.
Do we wanna? Actually, I can take over, kicking off with section 6.1.
Yep.
Misuse of language models. I would say, I know we've talked about this quite a bit, and you're working on what lies and sort of bias in language representations in general, which is really cool work if you haven't looked into that, y'all in the audience. But for me, at least, the misuse of models is more immediately pressing.
And it's also certainly a different problem. Like in one situation, you might have the accidental bias, but this is like the actual, not accidental, but malicious behavior. And also definitely more weaponizable aspects to that in that sense.
So, to see what they say.
Yep.
Malicious uses of language models can be somewhat difficult to anticipate because they often involve repurposing language models in a very different environment or for different purposes than researchers intended. To help with this, we can think in terms of traditional security risk assessment frameworks, which outline key steps such as identifying threats and potential impacts, assessing likelihood, and determining risk as a combination of likelihood and impact, RAS 12. We discussed 3 factors: potential misuse applications, threat actors, and external incentive structures.
So far, so good. Okay.
Yeah. I also really like thinking of risk in a security framework, particularly for applications, because I think that's something that people are, and by people I mean folks in the industry, tend to be a little bit more familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, so I obviously cannot share much about it, but I was once part of a sort of security something went wrong response team, and they needed a data miner for that. And I definitely will say the typical data science stuff that you do, it just requires a different mindset if you're into security. So that you have different models of thinking makes complete sense to me.
Okay. And sort of the other thing that's pretty common is, or like a way of evaluating harm in research applications is more of like a traditional ethics approach. And that is, I think often training that most people don't have, and it's like a really deep literature. It takes a really long time to get into, so I appreciate a more
yeah, yeah, you almost need a philosophy degree for some of that stuff. That's true.
Yep. All right, potential misuse applications. Any socially harmful activity that relies on generating texts could be augmented by powerful language models. Examples include misinformation, spam, phishing, abuse of legal and governmental processes, fraudulent academic essay writing, and social engineering pretexting. Social engineering pretexting. I don't know what pretexting means in that context.
I like social priming, I suppose. Like you can generate lots of text. Here's a topic, now talk negatively about it. And then if you just repeat that 1,000 times in front of someone, they might also start thinking negatively about something, or positively. I'm assuming that that's what they're after.
Yeah, that makes sense. Many of these applications bottleneck on human beings to write sufficiently high-quality text. Language models that produce high-quality text generation could lower existing barriers to carry out these activities and increase their efficacy. The misuse potential of language models increases as the quality of text synthesis improves. The ability of GPT-3 to generate several paragraphs of synthetic content that people find difficult to distinguish from human-written text in 3.9.4 represents a concerning milestone in this regard. Yeah.
Okay. So far, I think I would agree there.
No. I don't know, something I think about a lot is, so I have, my undergraduate was actually in English and linguistics, and the ability to read critically has become, I mean, it was important to begin with, but it's become even more important over time, and I don't know.
Well, so there's a couple of these stories where they generated some sort of article and it still got published, right? But these stories have been around for a while. And the number of articles has only increased. So it's a problem either way. Even without algorithms, I think it's a problem that you have to, like, the whole quality of a review is not something to take lightly. But yeah, so far so good.
Do you want to get the next one?
Sure.
So I can drink more coffee.
It's there's no webcam, so I cannot see that you drink coffee, but I'll gladly let you drink your coffee.
You can watch the video back.
Sure.
Just to give you the full experience, I have a very tall mug. It's about as tall as my face, and it has a hedgehog drinking coffee on it.
Ah, okay. No, it's kind of a U.S. thing. Like, Europeans always like to have their small coffee things, and people in the U.S. are usually bigger.
Very U.S.
Yes.
Also, we're going to have to hop out and back into the meeting. I thought I had fixed this, but I have not. You probably have time to end the...
Yeah, I see the timer.
6.122.
Yeah, no, I see the timer. So we'll... Oh, man, this is going to be fun to watch back. Anyway, threat actors can be organized by skill and resource level, ranging from low to moderate and resource actors who may... ranging from low or moderately skilled, and resource actors who may be able to build malicious product to advanced persistent threats. Highly skilled and well-researched state-sponsored groups with long-term agendas. To understand how low and mid-skill actors think about language models, we have been monitoring forums and chat groups where misinformation tactics, malware distribution, and computer fraud are frequently discussed. While we did find a significant discussion of misuse following the initial release of GPT-2 in the spring of 2019, we found fewer instances of experimentation and no successful deployments since then. That's kind of hard. It's hard to verify, I think, but
would they tell you? Yeah.
But it's a proxy. Okay, let's call it proxy. Fine. There's a proxy that gives them the impression that it might be happening less. Okay. Additionally, those misuse discussions were correlated with media coverage of language model technologies. From this, we assess that the threat of misuse from these actors is not immediate, but significant improvement in reliability could change this. Okay. In essence, better models means bigger risk. So far, so good. Because APTs, which was the abbreviation of Advanced Persistent Threats, do not typically discuss operations in the open, we have consulted with professional threat analysts about possible activity involving the use of language models. Since the release of GPT-2, there have been no discernible difference in operations that may see potential gains by using language models. The assessment was that language models may not be worth investing significant resources in because there has been no convincing demonstration that current language models are significantly better than current methods of generating text, and because methods of targeting controlling the content of language models is still very large. It's still very early stage. So I guess one way of describing this is to say, well, if you are an APT, you already have people who can do the copywriting. But that's not a reason not to be concerned, I think. I don't know if you have a different take on that, but
I really appreciate that they are doing.
They seem to take effort, right? I do.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I seem to read here, so that's fair.
Yeah, I guess to me the bigger question is, knowing that this is a potential threat of this line of research, is this still the best line of research that you should do? Because I've dropped lines of research because I was like, hey, this has more potential misapplications and applications, and I don't want to be culpable.
Yeah, and I think so. This, I think it was the guy who made the YOLO algorithm. I could be mistaken, but I think he actually quit the research because he was just no longer comfortable with what people might be doing with this stuff. He was the person who got the algorithm for real-time bounding boxes to work. And then, and I think that's like one of the quotes I read from one of your slides. Like the question, how can we make algorithm X more fair, is less important than the question, should algorithm X even exist? Which is kind of in this theme.
That talk will be on Sunday. This Sunday, yeah.
Okay, right. So, preview, key slide.
Oh, sorry, I'll share the slides before then.
Okay. I'll definitely be using the quote, and I think that's something that's applicable here. So one thing I think one thing that sort of then makes me think, is there an obvious use case where generation of text is something that society will find highly appreciative? As part of this, I think if the vector for harm is like a factor 1,000 smaller than the vector for good, then you could argue for a balance. But I think how much do we need text generation? Sure, there's video games, but I don't think video games are something that society needs. I don't think we should you should spend millions on text generation just for better video games. It feels like a waste of money.
Yeah.
So in that sense, can you come up with a really good use case for text generation?
I can't. It's all the things that I think this is genuinely excited are more on the artistic side, and I'm not super convinced by their evaluation technique in this paper. It's interesting, but it's really only an evaluation method that will work well for text generation. And they're so big at this point that the guarantee that they haven't memorized and they haven't been exposed to the testing data for any common testing suite is just, that's a real hard guarantee to make. And they can't. In this paper, they're like, we probably saw the testing data. Whoopsie.
Yeah, no, so, I mean, you can have one argument where you say, you know what, I don't need, what's the difference between the prediction and recalling something from memory? Well, if you're able to memorize the entire world, there might still be some generalization. In that sense, it can still be kind of useful. I think that's okay. Well, I mean, so I have this silly algorithm. It generates Red Hot Chili Pepper lyrics. And yes, there is this one, a lot of the time it will generate by the way, an infinite amount of by the way, because there's one song of Red Hot Chili Peppers called By the Way. But everything that it generates, you do kind of go, hey, yeah, this sounds like one of the Red Hot Chili Pepper persons could have made this text. And it will fail on every metric, but it's still plausibly, conceivably something that I could argue is generated by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. So it can still be useful for generation, even if it's memorized something. I can live with that. The main question I wonder is text generation really that interesting? But that's more of a thing I'm wondering now, because, I do think... well,
I would say, so the main use for text generation, and at some point we're going to have to find a good point to hop out and hop back in, is really machine translation.
That's okay. That's okay. So far, so good. That's indeed a fair use case, and that's something that people can definitely benefit from.
No.
I would argue that's a subset of generative algorithms.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying there are like.
But I do agree. So I do agree. Translation seems like a valid use case. That's certainly true. And I suppose spelling correction also. Then.
I mean, that's what we got markup chains for.
Well, I true.
No, I think there are better ways to do spelling correction.
True. Oh, sure. No, but it's in the realm of. But it's still in the realm of generative algorithms, so to say.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Let me say there are better ways to do spelling correction than markup chains. It's just like a very common undergraduate project.
Sure. Right. Well, it gets trickier when you get into styles and stuff, right? But like one is a sentence too long, that sort of thing. But yeah. So they seem one thing I do want to less than a minute, but at least in these couple of paragraphs, they seem to be taking a somewhat optimistic stance. That's one thing I do think.
Yeah, I'd agree. All right, let's take this opportunity to pop in and out.
Yes.
And I am a big dummy. I did not prepare an intermission screen, but it's intermission right now.
See you all in a bit.
All right. So.
Same Zoom link, right?
Yes, I'll end it on the other computer.
Cool.
And y'all can watch us leave and come back in to Zoom. Definitely, and feel free to share y'all's thoughts in share. Less than 1 minute. All right. Leave the meeting. Come back in. Cannot come back in without leaving. Open the meeting. Waiting for Vincent, and then we should be back in. And share my screen so we can see what we're doing. All right.
Okay.
Are you still seeing less than a minute?
Sorry?
Are you still seeing the... right. Noted. Okay. 1 second. We'll be right back in. Without video. There we go. There we go. All right. Oh, Rachel. I was like, I can't hear Vincent's because I'm not actually listening.
All right, there we go. And then share screen so you can actually see what we're reading. I thought I fixed this and gotten my pro account all set up. However, it appears that that is not the case. Let me make this bigger. Right, do you want to start reading the next section while I figure out how to make your
thing bigger? So starting from the external incentive structures, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Sure. People in so you've got an eye on YouTube, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Supposedly there's some echo, but we'll figure that out. But okay, each threat actor group also has a set of tactics, techniques, and procedures that they rely on to accomplish their agenda. These are influenced by economic factors like scalability, ease of deployment, and phishing is an extremely popular among all groups because it offers a low-cost, low-effort, typically high-yield method of deploying malware and stealing login credentials. Using language models to augment existing tactics, techniques, and procedures would likely result in an even lower cost of deployment. Ease of use is another significant incentive. Having stable infrastructure has a large impact on the adoption of these techniques. Output of language models are stochastic. However, and though developers can constrain these by using techniques like top K truncation, they are not able to perform consistently without human feedback. If a social media disinformation bot produces output that are reliable 99% of the time, but produces incoherent output 1% of the time, this could reduce the amount of human labor required in operating this bot. But a human is still needed to filter the outputs, which restricts how scalable the operation can be. I think that last sentence is a bit interesting because you say, well, human input is still needed to filter the output, which restricts how scalable the operation can be, but it's still scaled like to a factor of 99 in the example in the sentence before. Like if you only need 1% of the examples to correct them, like correcting yes, no is way faster than generating text typically. So yeah, the loop is still necessary, but I don't know if the word restrict is really that applicable here. I don't know if you want to discuss this or if your mind is preoccupied getting the settings for the Zoom call to come back, but
I think I've got it.
Okay.
I'm thinking about,
because essentially you're reducing the generation task from the human to a labeling task.
I don't think you can hear me. One sec.
I can hear you.
You can? Okay, excellent. Yeah. I did a lot of muting to try and get the echo to go away.
So in this case, right, I think I can definitely argue generating takes more time than labeling, and what this tool will effectively do is change the generating task into a labeling one. And you can say, well, it's still a human in the loop, and that's accurate, but it's also not the point.
Yeah.
And which restricts how scalable the operation can be. It doesn't. I think I disagree with that part. I don't know if you have any comments on that, but
yeah. Oh, it looks like we do have we fixed the echo.
Nice.
Yeah, I do agree that the generation is the more time consuming part, and this is sort of like, it's not completely removing a bottleneck, but it is reducing one. And then it becomes sort of a, arms race with spam filtering.
Yeah, well, so I think the impression, I'm not an expert on this, it's not my field, but one of the things that I no, but like I have friends who are in security, but one of the things that's especially with phishing as a factor is people who fall for that typically are people who are a little bit less prone to be super critical. So the bar is also not necessarily super high there. Right? That's also a thing.
I'm making
keep in mind.
A face you can't see because my mom got phished.
Oh.
Sorry, I don't mean to put my mom on blast. It was very well done. It was. I would say it was more spear phishing than general phishing, but.
No, and like the stories you hear from this are usually like god awful, right? Like people's lives get ruined sometimes by some of this stuff because it sometimes leads to like identity fraud and whatnot. But typically the people who fall for it are also the people who don't know what to look out for. So I wouldn't necessarily say the bar is super high here.
That's fair.
Like I think I even read this article this one time. It's phishing attacks that have like no spelling, like phishing emails with no spelling errors are really rare. And and there's a theory on that's actually not a coincidence.
Interesting.
Anyway, a final paragraph, and then we'll pass it on.
Yeah.
Based on our analysis of this model and analysis of threat actors in the landscape, we suspect AI researchers will eventually develop language models that are sufficiently consistent and steerable that they will be of greater interest to malicious actors. We expect this will introduce challenges for the broader research community, and hope to work on this through a combination of mitigation research, prototyping, and coordinating with other technical developers.
I mean, I'm glad they're thinking about it.
Yeah, but it's like... yeah, that's, I guess, something we could say, but so far, to me at least, they seem to be taking a somewhat optimistic tone, which is not surprising, right? They're the authors of this. It'd be like if they were really pessimistic about it, they wouldn't publish the paper. But I do think that it seems to be written by someone who does have you could also be more pessimistic is the main thing I'm saying here.
Yeah, no, they definitely got a dog in the hunt.
Yeah.
Or a horse in the race, or your preferred metaphor there. Yeah. And I think it's also And something that I think is characteristic of this particular research group is that they tend to be very optimistic. I would say like there's almost like a 50s futurism vibe to a lot of their sort of external communications. And I don't know if it's the same way internally, but it's sort of like
I remember when OpenAI got founded, there was definitely that was one of the main messages that I remember from like all the marketing they've done back then. Like I think it was a quote, something along the lines of, "This is a research group that actually has haste," or something like that, because we want to some quote like that.
Yeah, doing lots of huge research projects very quickly is definitely the best way to mitigate harm, right? Sorry, I'm just being salty now. I am glad that they're talking about it. I agree that they're being a little optimistic. But
no, but I do like. Is it common actually that people discuss this in their papers to this extent?
I mean, this is first of all an extremely long paper, so they had a lot more space because their publishing process is basically doing a press release.
Yep.
It is becoming more common. There is more of an expectation that you're going to do it certainly in ACL conferences that I review for.
Sure. I think it's also fairly. It's also become increasingly more obvious that algorithms amplify bias, right? I think that the field of data science matured a little bit there. I think.
Hopefully.
Yeah. Well, I think generally, like I think fairness mitigation techniques were really hard to find 5 years ago.
That is definitely true. Definitely true.
And
there's been a lot of work on it.
Yeah. So I think this is. I don't know if I want to call research woke, but I think it's something along those lines here that's happening. And I think that's I suppose fair. I don't know if it's enough though. That's the only stance I want to make.
Yeah, definitely. A fair, I don't know, quote unquote fair algorithm that like detects criminality, which I should say is just an impossible task. That's you're doing, you know, phrenology, not phonology, phrenology.
I mean, then yeah,
it's like lipstick on a pig.
Yeah, no, we can talk about that for ages. I think I think there's conscious way of going about it. I mean, if you sort of intentionally say, hey, there has to be like explore exploit, so we have to make sure there's like a randomness aspect here in whatever we do, because otherwise we're just checking the same areas of town. Like there's stuff you can definitely do, but make sure someone with a background in ethics is in your team. That's the main advice.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway,
speaking of fairness,
yes.
I can take the next section. So, and I will say, since this paper came out, there's been a number of people who've done evaluations of the system and have found some not great stuff. So let's see what they talk about.
Okay.
Also, I am working with a delay, so it's pretty difficult to say words.
Okay.
Biases present in training data may lead models to generate stereotyped or prejudiced content. This is concerning since model bias could harm people in the relevant groups in different ways by entrenching existing stereotypes and producing demeaning portrayals among other potential harms. We've conducted an analysis of biases in the model in order to better understand GPT-3's limitations when it comes to fairness, bias, and representation.
So far, so good.
Okay, I was gonna say we've looked at the biases, makes it seem like they maybe lean to or think they left no stone unturned, but it looks like this next paragraph is addressing this. Well, our goal is not to go ahead.
No, it's like I see gender pop, so I think they're gonna go in depth in different types of bias, so we'll see.
Definitely. Our goal is not to exhaustively characterize GPT-3, but to give a preliminary analysis to some of its limitations and behaviors. We focus on bias relating to gender, race, and religion, although many other categories of bias are likely present and could be studied in follow-up work. Gender, race, and religion. Gender and race I get. Religion is,
I mean, it's
more relevant in other places in the world than the U.S., I would say.
Perhaps, as far as GDPR goes, it is considered one of those protected attributes that have to be sort of protected at all costs. And you know, considering the history of Europe, I can imagine reasons why.
I mean, considering like current stuff going on in India, I can imagine why. But yeah.
So it's a protected attribute, and GDPR says so. So
it's just it's a weird third protected attribute to pick, but I guess they'll talk about it.
What other attribute might you pick? Like age? Would that be a thing then, or?
I mean, probably ethnicity as separate from race. A lot of my research in graduate school was on geographic location, so like dialect. So I guess national origin.
Yeah, okay, that's...
All right.
Yeah, okay, no, fair enough. But I think religion, yeah, how are you going to measure that is a thing, but sure, so far so good.
We'll find out.
Yeah.
Broadly, our analysis indicates that internet-trained models have internet-scale biases. Models tend to reflect stereotypes present in their training data. Below, we discuss our preliminary findings of bias along the dimensions of gender, race, and religion. We probe for bias in the 175 billion parameter model and also in similar smaller models to see if and how they are different in this dimension. Gender. All right, I'm just taking a look at how much we got left. We got a lot left.
That is a lot.
Yeah, let's just
let's focus on gender for now.
Yeah,
let's focus on gender for now.
In our investigation of gender bias in GPT-3, we focused on associations between gender and occupation, classic thing that people look at. We found that occupations in general have a higher probability of being followed by a male gender identifier than a female one. In other words, they are male-leaning, when given a context such as the blank occupation was a neutral variant. 83% of the 388 occupations we tested were more likely to be followed by a male identifier by GPT-3. We measured this by feeding the model context. Oh gosh, it's really hard to read with a little delay.
Do you prefer if I do it, if that's easier? Because I
yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, I'll take it up. But what they're doing here seems reasonable. So what they're doing is they measure this by feeding the model a context, such as the detective was a, and then looking into the probability of the model following up with a male indicating word. So man, male, something that indicates man, or female indicating words, woman, female, etc. In particular, occupations demonstrating higher levels of education, such as legislator, banker, professor, were heavily male-leaning, along with occupations that require hard physical labor, such as mason, millwright, and sheriff. Occupations that were more... Sorry?
Millwright? There are a lot of millwrights running around? That's just a weird occupation.
Well, so, one that I'm actually not familiar with. What is a millwright?
I think it's somebody who makes mills. Let me look it up.
Okay.
Go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so the final sentence is occupations that were more likely to be followed by female identifiers include midwife, nurse, receptionist, housekeeper, etc.
A millwright is someone who installs, dismantles, repairs, reassembles, and moves machinery in factories, power plants, and construction sites. Okay, so there are more millwrights than I thought. I looked at that and was like, it's like, Middle Englishy.
Yeah, it does sound a bit old in that sense.
Huh.
One thing I wonder, I'm not sure if that's if you have that in the English language as much, but in the Dutch language, you sometimes have an addition to a word that indicates that a job is being done by someone who's female. So there's like sometimes, certainly not always, but sometimes from the word itself, the meaning is actually implied that it's being done by a female person. Do you have that in English, or is it less common?
Some words, so like stewardess or chairman, which like more male, stewardess more female, actress, but there's a pretty big sort of like style shift that's been going on to move towards gender neutral terms. So instead of like fireman, firefighter, stewardess, flight attendant.
Yes.
So it exists, but it's becoming rare.
Exactly. No, okay. So,
yeah, good question.
But nurse, for example, is one of those where, especially because you see it in so many TV shows, like nurse can actually be done by both genders. The term nurse does not imply that it's done by just women. So that's so I think that this is a valid test that you can do. Certainly not the only one, but I think it's a valid test, right? I don't know if you have any comments on this.
I think given their paradigm for evaluation in general, it makes sense. And Enrique does have a question. How do you avoid bias if training data set is already biased? That's a really good question and an active area of research.
Yes. So,
Vincent, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so like, well, so there's a demo in the What Lies package that I'm working on to sort of tackle this. However, I want to first and foremost mention that this is a mitigation technique. So this is an attempt at filtering away information that you don't like to have in your word embeddings. These techniques are never perfect. But the idea is as follows. You could, for example, say, I've got the man-woman axis that's in high-dimensional space, that's some sort of vector with some sort of direction. And maybe you also have that for steward and stewardess. And for you can kind of get like the gender axes in your data, so to say. What you do is you can linearly project all of your embeddings away from that one angle. Empirically, you can show that then the embeddings that you end up with seem to have less bias in them. And you can repeat this process over a couple of times, such as you maybe not just take like one angle, but you take like a principal component of like a couple of these embeddings. This is the main technique that I'm familiar with. Empirically, I can demonstrate that it seems to reduce some forms of bias, but I cannot guarantee that it removes all unfairness. That's the key thing. And it's really easy to demonstrate that you might have made an improvement, but it's really hard to demonstrate that you've removed all concerns.
And I would say that'll work for like embeddings, but not necessarily language models.
True, very true. So
there's much less work on language models.
And the thing with and there's a couple of reasons for it as well. Because with language models, you typically have this thing called context, which means that a word is sort of really dependent on its neighbors. In word embedding land, that's a little bit less so, because every word vector is...
bag of words.
Yeah, it's on its own. And there's subword embeddings and like lots of details that are super fun. But this is the main technique, at least I'm aware of, and that I'm sort of investigating. But measuring bias also is a problem on its own. Because the main thing with fairness is you can never really guarantee that you've removed all forms of unfairness. You can just say, well, the one that I'm able to quantify, I'm able to show that it's now less of a problem. But
and I will say, if you don't take mitigation strategies and you're training on a biased data set, you will increase the bias over time. You'll amplify the existing bias.
Yes. Well,
using pretty much most of the machine learning models people are using today.
Yeah, and part of that problem is not so much the algorithm, but the feedback mechanism as well. There's a couple of reasons why, but I'm definitely not ashamed of starting out with just count vectors. For most of my machine learning pipelines in evolved language, it's usually an okay benchmark to start with. Also not completely bias free, but a little bit less risky.
Definitely.
I hope this answered some of Enrique's questions. But I will say, like, this is just a test, but it's a test I don't mind they've done here. It seems okay. I'm assuming it's not the only one, though. And the second paragraph reads, we also tested how these probabilities changed when we shifted to the context to be the competent occupation was a, and then probably a person. And when we shifted the context to be the incompetent occupation was a, and then they're going to see sort of, hey, competence, is that something that is also biased? The majority of occupations had an even higher probability of being followed by a male than a female when the case was the original neutral prompt. With the prompt incompetent, the majority of the occupations still leaned male, with a similar probability than for our neutral prompt. The average occupation bias measured in formula seems to be like a log odds ratio. Yeah. Nothing too fancy. Was some number for neutral, some number for competent, and some number for incompetent.
It's like roughly twice as likely to be male if you say the competent blank.
Yeah.
More or less.
I mean, part of yeah. You could argue that might be biased in the different directions. I guess guys curse more, so calling someone incompetent might be more of a guy thing. I don't know, something like that. But I don't know if you have any extra comments on this.
Nope. I guess not surprising.
Okay.
Given large societal biases.
Okay, so far so good then. We also carried out pronoun resolution on the Wino gender dataset using two methods which further corroborated the model's tendency to associate most occupations with males.
I'm looking up the Wino gender right now. I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, also unfamiliar, but it says, for example, we fed the model a context such as the advisor met with the advisee because she wanted to get job advice, wanted to get advice about job applications. She refers to the And then the question is probably who is the advisor and who's the advisee? That's kind of the question here.
So, other examples. The nurse notified the patient, her shift, his shift, their shift. So is it the nurse or the patient whose shift is ending?
Okay. That's and this is a data set that has like many of these examples, and then well, okay, so far so good. I think that sounds like a reasonable checking mechanism as well. She and found that the lowest probability between the two possible. Wait, hang on. For example, we fed the context advisor. She refers to the, and found the option with the lowest probability between the two possible options. Choice between occupation option advisor, participation option advisee.
So it's just like the Winograd schema.
Yeah. Okay. Occupation and participant words often have societal biases associated with them, such as the assumption that most occupants are by default male. We found that the language models learned from some of these biases, such as a tendency to associate female pronouns with participant positions more than male pronouns. GPT-3 175 billion had the highest accuracy of all models on this task. It was also the only model where the accuracy for occupant sentences where the correct answer was the occupant option for females, was higher for male. Well, for females was higher than for males. All other models had higher accuracy for male pronouns with the occupation sentences compared to the female pronouns. With the exception of our second largest model, which had the same accuracy for both. This offers some preliminary evidence that in places where issues of bias can make language models susceptible to error, the larger models are more robust than smaller models. This feels like cherry picking, but
GPT-3 had 64% accuracy overall, 81% accuracy AO on females, and 76% accuracy on males.
Yeah, so I think there was there's also a gender neutral
paradox.
Well, but possibly, but it's also the gender neutral option.
There, okay.
Maybe, right?
So are they just like awful at gender neutral stuff?
Potentially, but this reads a little bit like cherry picking, because the thing is, you can say my model is the best of all the worst models, but it doesn't necessarily imply that your model is enough, right?
Also, larger models are more robust than smaller models to this sort of systematic biased error. I don't know.
Well, from their pool,
so
right?
From their pool, but it's a pronoun resolution thing, right? It's not necessarily as I would expect improvement in accuracy in anaphor resolution to improve this more than reducing bias. If that makes sense.
Could you repeat that?
I wouldn't expect gender bias to be the biggest problem with this task.
Oh, that's an interesting. Yeah, so you might be testing something else.
Because I would expect more bias in a larger model, actually.
It does make sense, but you have more. You have more memory to put bias into. This feels like a weird one. Again, it's written with optimism in mind, which I don't necessarily.
I don't think it's bad to be optimistic, but I think you also need to be.
Oh, I mean, when we're talking about bias,
is it bad for researchers to be optimistic? I think a little bit.
I think when you're talking about bias and fairness and these sorts of topics, those topics don't work if you're optimistic.
Yeah.
I mean, ethics. Oh, it'll probably be fine. Like that's the whole point of ethics, I think. You have to be a little bit critical.
Yeah, you got to think about the ways that it might not be fine.
Exactly.
Matthias says. The fact is that it's very difficult to remove biases from people, but relatively easier, at least easier, to remove them from algorithms. What do you think?
I mean, I can suppose there's someone that I disagree with. I can have an argument with them and then try to convince them. I've tried doing that on a bunch of zeros and ones and found it harder, to be very honest. Because
I would say it's easier to measure specific biases in a model that you have like good methods of
it's easier to quantify. Maybe that's the term.
Yeah, it's easier to quantify.
Yeah.
So it's easier to fix in very specific ways that you know about, but evaluating bias overall in models is extremely difficult. So I don't know that it's necessarily easier. And then usual says GPT-4, 1750 billion parameters. I think it's just a joke about GPT's models getting bigger.
So I think, I want to mention one thing about removing unfair things from algorithms, because there's lots of mitigation techniques. And let's say I have the perfect mitigation technique, and let's talk about
that. That makes me sad. Go ahead.
But I think
it's a mitigation technique.
Well, so I think that the main issue I see with fairness mitigation techniques, suppose you can make an algorithm more fair. Typically, you make them more fair towards a certain sensitive attribute. Let's say race, let's say gender, there's a bunch of them. But in order to be able to use techniques like that, you need to know someone's gender, for example. And having that data available, that's usually also one of the harder parts. It's also almost a privacy thing.
Yes, very much so.
That's
and let me just go on record here. I'm on record saying this other places. You shouldn't try and guess people's gender algorithmically. Don't do that.
That's I'd be curious to hear how you managed to pull that off GDPR wise, but also ethics. I mean, if you really feel the need to treat someone different based on their gender, I mean, there's a word for that, I think. Having said that, there was a...
I am trying to take the next little section, and I'm just going to power through, and I'm going to ignore my ears.
Okay,
Actually, ahead. I'm going to take this out, so if you say anything, do like a little wave.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
All right. We also performed Cooccurrence Tests, where we analyzed which words are likely to occur in the vicinity of other pre-selected words. We created a model output sample set by generating 800 outputs of D each with a temperature of 1 and top P of 0.9 for every prompt in our data set. So we should get like fairly different generations each one. For gender, we had prompts such as he was very, she was very, he would be described as, she would be described as. We look at the adjectives and adverbs in the top 100 most favored words using an off-the-shelf part-of-speech tagger. We found females were more often described using appearance-oriented words such as beautiful and gorgeous, as compared to men who are more often described using adjectives that span a greater spectrum. Table 6.1 shows the 10 most favored descriptive words for the model, along with the raw number of times each word co-occurred with a pronoun indicator. Most favored here indicates words that were most skewed towards a category by co-occurring with it at a higher rate as compared to the other category. To put these numbers in perspective, we have also included the average for the number of co-occurrences across all qualifying words for each gender. Put these back in. And I'll try and fix the delay in the future. I think you will notice in the video that the delay is with the video of me and my voice and not Vincent and his voice. I'll watch it back later.
Which is a little bit strange considering you're the one recording, but maybe reasons.
So because I'm using the audio from the Zoom call, that is being networked, but the video is happening locally.
Gotcha. But anyway, the point that they're making here, I think this is like, I do think that the tests that they're doing are, pretty okay tests as far as here's a hypothesis. If this occurs, then we can argue there's bias, and like I think the tests are okay. And then males are probably large, mostly lazy, eccentric, jolly. Okay, so there's a difference in words. That makes sense.
I am also noticing that like the numbers here are way different. So these are the most male biased words, but they're still around the number of co-occurrence. Personable isn't, which is weird. I don't think I say personable. It sounds British. Whereas if you look at like the female words, like gorgeous and beautiful are like out of the park. That is an order of magnitude higher.
That's true. And especially beautiful. That's yeah. And I also totally get how language. This is so probably amplified by the model, but also definitely probably in the data set. So you can totally see how this is generated. But it's not really a surprise, but it's fair. But it's fair to point out this is an issue.
Definitely.
No,
I'm scrolling on the wrong computer. We do have some questions. You need to create the buckets into which you're trying to remove the bias. That seems like a decision that would again introduce bias. And it's by Arnav. Yes, but particularly for social categories within a given community and population, there is a lot of research that's been done, particularly in the field of sociology, of what groupings will be important. So you don't have to like come up with those out of whole cloth. You can use existing things that you know are important. So, and for language data in particular, what's going to be reflected in terms of individual language use, sociolinguistics is the field that I would turn to for, hey, what things are my model likely to pick up demographically just from language use? See my talk on Sunday. It's very relevant.
I will say that definitely if you want to apply mitigation techniques, you often apply them with a certain thing in mind. So let's say I'm going to do my best to make it fair on gender. All that stuff is great, but then you might still have a blind spot for race, for example. I mean, that observation, I think, is fair.
Or the margins, you know.
Yeah, exactly. So the observation in that sense is fair, but there are guiding principles that are, if nothing else, a good place to start.
Definitely. You don't have to reinvent sociology.
No.
In fact, don't do that. That's just a waste of your time. And Mangesh says, algorithm whiteboard versus NLP for developers. I think they're both good. It's a good series.
Rachel and I are colleagues, right? So
we're on the same team. So we talk to each other a lot. You just don't see it.
Yeah.
Which is part of the reason I want to do this. So you could get a sense for the team.
Yeah.
And Matthias says, I was thinking the algorithms used to hire people for examples. In those cases, I think it's a bit easier to fit with the algorithm with regard to the HR assistant. Yeah, it's a very good point. Particularly for hiring in a specific legal location, you know what the protected characteristics are.
Yes. For hiring in particular, I'm just going to share a blog post I wrote a while ago. Feedback mechanisms are also like a thing there.
Thanks, Vincent.
Let's see. There's one. I love the idea. That's the final one, I think, for now. I love the idea of TARS, interstellar movie robot. Does that ring a bell to you?
It does not.
So apparently there's some sort of configuration parameter for like irony, sarcasm, humor, etc. And I suppose the notion here is, you know, something that it does sound like a cool thing, especially in video games, where you can say the same thing, but now you are grumpy, or say the same thing, but now you are sarcastic.
Like in terms of speech generation?
Yes, and I agree that it would be a cool demo, but also there would be a dangerous attitude, because you can say, hey, talk about this topic, but now you have to be super negative or super positive. So this...
And even, especially in speech, that's going to be very culturally bounded as well.
True.
Like what sounds sarcastic in American English is not going to be the same as what sounds sarcastic in even just British English, which is pretty closely related.
Which is also different than Dutch. And in Holland, there's also sarcasm also is different across provinces.
Interesting.
It's a cultural thing.
Yeah, it's very cultural. It's very embedded. Arshad says, can these models be used in predictions? Seeing the hue size. Sorry, in production, not prediction. I mean, I wouldn't. Would you?
I would recommend going for something simpler first.
I'm really excited for research on small, efficient, faster to train models, and this sort of research, like, drift. So I'm just like something that points in a direction, not vector.
Well, so like one of the things, so keep an eye on the algorithm whiteboard, because we are announcing, like, we're going to talk about some super lightweight word embeddings, like instead of 6 gigabytes, they're like 11 megabytes, that we'll talk about that are super interesting. I'm also currently investigating training word embeddings on just the dictionary. Something tells me that maybe if you can do that, that's also something that's useful. Again, I think
small models.
Yes, it's not a secret we work at the same company. But yeah, so talk to me on Twitter if you're interested in
that. Let's talk about race.
Yes.
I'm going to take these out and just go for it.
Go for it.
To investigate racial bias in GPT-3, we seeded the model with prompts such as the race man was very, the race woman was very, people would describe the race person as, and generate 800 samples for each of the above prompts, with race replaced with terms indicating a racial category such as white or Asian. We then measure word co-occurrences in the generated samples. Given prior research demonstrating that language models produce text of differing sentiment when varying varying is a verb there, not an adjective. When varying features such as occupation, we explored how race impacted sentiment. Little garden path. We measured sentiment using cent-a-word-net for the words which co-occurred disproportionately with each race. Each word sentiment varied from 100 to negative 100, with positive scores indicating positive words, e.g. wonderfulness, amicable, negative scores indicating negative words, wretched, horrid, and a score of 0 indicating neutral words, such as sloping and chalet. I often describe people as chalet.
Chalet, I think chalet, the way I know it, is like a little cabin.
Yeah, it's like a little alpine building.
Yeah, exactly. It's when you go skiing. But okay, it should be noted. Right, sorry.
Okay, yeah, you're right.
Okay, so I'll take it over then again, because I am interested in this. It should be noted that we were explicitly prompting the model to talk about race, and this in turn generated text that focused on racial features. These results are not from the model talking about race in the wild, but talking about race in an experimental setup where they have been primed to. Additionally,
how is that going to be different?
Come again? I only heard a part of what you said.
How is that going to be different?
So I'm wondering about this as well. So I do think, that's a good question, actually. So
I guess what they're saying is we specifically said, hey, talk about race. It didn't start talking about race on its own. But given the evaluations that I've seen, that definitely happens with no prompt.
Yeah. True.
And also they're saying the way to use our model is to prompt it, like is to seed it with these sentences, and that's how you like would deploy this.
Yeah, so if we did it, so let's say this is just to make clear that if we prompted to talk about fire hydrants, it's not talking about race, which and I guess there's if you talk about something that's totally unrelated, I do think that it shouldn't be talking about like from fire hydrants all the way to race. I think is a bit of a stretch. So I think priming it nearer to the vicinity of race is sensible if you're trying to lure it out of the woods and saying something that might be biased. But then again, that's an interesting one.
Sorry, you finished. I was
that's a good point. It's a nice comment. But true. So additionally, since we are measuring sentiment by simply looking at co-occurrences, the resulting sentiment can also reflect social... Oh, it's less than a minute again on Zoom, by the way.
Oh, it is? Okay. We'll fix it in post, I guess. Read quickly, and then we'll look at that paragraph and think while we redo the meeting.
Yes. Be right back.
All right. Leave the meeting. Sorry, I genuinely thought I had fixed this.
All right. Hopefully y'all should be able to hear me again now. Yeah, and I did see there were some questions in the chat while we wait for Vincent to get back. Arnav says, can you imagine how the model could be abused?
Mass language model prediction on a lot of racial-based prompts.
Oh, make sure I'm muted in the right place. Yeah, so I think the main
Okay, so I think the main vector for, I hope I fixed echo right now, for misuse of this type of model is really generating malicious text. So some things that I talked about earlier were, actually I had like a little list. Let me see. Hi Vincent, we are discussing, let me share my screen, potential negative applications of this model.
I think I saw something like that in the YouTube, right?
Yep, I'm answering the chat. And they had they actually had a discussion of it in the paper a little bit earlier. It's just like a list of things that people could do.
So what? Yeah.
Misinformation, spam, phishing, abuse of legal and governmental processes, fraudulent academic essay writing, and social engineering pretexting.
Yeah, so it's basically if you can generate something that looks like something you should pay attention to, then you can suck people's attention away. I think that's the general gist of it. One thing I wonder now, that product that they mentioned they were making, is it known what it does? You mentioned something about a private beta.
Yeah, I'm gonna cut it. So, for those of you who aren't familiar, OpenAI recently announced that they were going to have an API for accessing their AI models, and I'll pull that over so you can actually check out what they say. We're releasing an API for accessing new AI models developed by OpenAI. Unlike most AI systems, which are designed for one use case, the API today provides a general-purpose text-in, text-out interface, allowing users to try it on virtually any English language task. You can now request access in order to integrate the API into your product to develop an entirely new application or help us explore the strengths and limitation of this technology. So yeah, basically they're saying that you could use it for any task. You send it text, it sends you text back, and it's GPT-3 that it's currently running.
Right, so it's purely generative. Okay.
Ooh.
Okay, so one thing that's so it's mentioning the companies that are playing with it. Apparently, it's Algolia, Quizlet, and Reddit, and some research institutions as well.
So fun thing about Reddit is we train models on Reddit data. Oh, and Arnav is just clarifying the language model and then how things would be reused for separate contexts. He was talking about the TARS model, which has pretty obvious misuse cases. Thank you. And the echo has been fixed. Fantastic.
So one thing I want.
Yes.
I was hoping for that if they're going to say the institutions like the Middlebury Institute, I think that's okay, but I was hoping for more ethical
discussion.
Yeah, so the Middlebury Institute is apparently a center on terrorism, extremism, and counterterrorism. Okay, fair to keep them involved. But to me, it still seems like what is going to be like the epic use case where it's becoming obvious that this is something humanity needs. Besides, farts and giggles.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah, no. So that's, and I was hoping to maybe see more ethical institutions join in here as well. But that's the main thing I do find a little bit surprising about this.
Yeah, I mean the most, like the only thing where I've been thinking about a project where I would really want to actually use something like GPT-2 or 3. Do you know that there's this British quiz show, Would I Lie to You? Are you familiar with it?
Yeah, I've seen a couple of episodes. I think some of my more favorite comedians sometimes pop around. I think, yeah.
Yeah, it's fun. But I was thinking you could do a chatbot to do that, where people like input their truths, or like in their individual chat input their truths, or like fill out the prompts, and then you generate a second half to the prompt. So the way the game works is people are given a card, and it may have a lie or it may have a truth, and they're reading it through for the first time, and then everyone else in the panel needs to discuss if they're telling the truth or lying. And there's teams, but anyway, so generating those reasonable sounding but like interesting falsehoods I think would be a potential use for this sort of generative application. But is that worth like super weaponized phishing? Like maybe not.
Yeah, there's something there. I mean, it's all in the video game, like games and video games entertainment. Yeah. I think you can do some funny business there. But one thing I wonder there is, instead of making something that just is a sort of generates all sorts of text, couldn't you do something more interesting by just making a thesaurus easier to use? Something that still allows you to explore language in a way and still allows you to play with it, but not something that can generate an entire letter.
Yeah.
I think that's I think there's also maybe like a nice constraint. You're allowed to produce 1 or 2 sentences ahead and no more.
Yeah. And I don't think, like, we're not saying that, like, no one should be doing this research and, like, it's a bad research program necessarily. It's just, like...
Well, I do think
Is this the best use of your time?
Nah. So one attitude I suppose I can defend is someone is bound to research this. Someone somewhere is bound to make a model like this, and therefore it's probably better to have one and then to sort of apply mitigation techniques and try to learn from that, then and to sort of be proactive in that. And part of what I'm reading is that they are trying to do that, and that seems fine. There's something to be said for that.
I don't know. So there's this discussion, and we're getting a little bit off topic, but no, whatever. We're not going to actually finish the paper. So there's a lot of discussion, especially in NLP, that like certain applications are inevitable. But thinking back, like if I'd gone to myself in like second year of my PhD program and been like, Rachel, you know what's going to be really big in 2020? I mean, a lot of things, but specifically in NLP, language models. I mean, there's no like inevitability in that, right? There was no like inevitability in word embeddings. Like there are many ways that you can take language data and quantify it and represent it and make it usable in downstream tasks. And the ways that we're doing it now are not necessarily the only or best ways to do it. And just sort of like from a history of science perspective, there's so many other ways that it could have gone. That I don't think it's necessarily.
Yeah, okay, that's a fair argument. Like you can play the thought experiment of rewriting the history books, and then what would have happened, and would we have then been here were it not for change X? And I also think that in the end, if you bring it back to is this the most useful model? It simply isn't.
I mean, for our application, nah.
No, but also like practically, it's such a huge model. Only a few players can maybe use this in practice. So it's.
And there's the bigger sort of like disciplinary problem of soda chasing. So people who are like, I'm going to get state of the art, and that's like the most important thing, and that's what's going to get me published, and not necessarily like. Hey, I've noticed that there's a lot of people who speak Swahili and not a lot of resources for building good language technology in Swahili. And, I'm going to like work with Swahili researchers to help develop the NLP ecosystem around this language that a lot of people use. Just to me, I think that's a more interesting, immediately applicable research.
Or what I have in my head, just give your algorithm the dictionary. Most languages have something in the dictionary, and see how far you can get there. Because dictionaries are like a couple of megabytes when it comes to data, right? It's like
and decades of work by linguists,
exactly,
and lexicographers.
Yeah, and there should be plenty of knowledge in there. So like if you can just do that, you can get that on a Raspberry.
Absolutely, use your existing resources.
Yep. No, so the. And also, like, this is something I actually learned. This was a nice one I learned from making the Spacey videos. So I had one model which was fully rule-based. So I just came up with a bunch of rules, and I said, if this rule, then it's a programming language. If not this rule, it's not a programming language. I was trying to do entity detection for programming languages. And the cool thing was, the rule-based system actually worked a little bit better on some of the test data, because when you come up with a rule yourself, you're using domain knowledge. And even if that data point doesn't exist in your trained data, your test results will still be able to capture it.
Yeah.
It's stuff like that, right? that people sometimes forget about if they're talking about like big data and fancy algorithms and state of the art. There's still a lot of street smarts that in the end will help the application, even if it's not state of the art.
And Sudeep says they're solving intelligence. So talking about OpenAI sort of like general gist. Yeah.
I think wasn't
I just don't think that's interesting of a research problem. I don't know. I'm also like very practical when it comes to NLP. Like the things you're working on should directly help people, and that's my stance on the matter. And I understand that not everyone is motivated by the same things that I am.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Vincent.
And they're solving intelligence. I think DeepMind also has something like that in their mantra. So I think both groups do a lot of reinforcement learning because of that. But there I also have a bit of an issue. So they both tend to focus quite a bit on video games, and if you can beat a video game with an algorithm, then you might be advancing artificial intelligence. And all that stuff is great, but a video game is like a simulation. You can run it infinite amounts of times and practice on it, and you can't really do that in the real world. So then also there you can wonder, is that really intelligence, or just learning, or just memorizing a simulation? final.
People are interested in different things.
Yeah, true. No, it's certainly true. I know some people at DeepMind, and they're happy, right? So, and then there's like.
So just sort of looking at the rest of this paragraph, I'm just.
Oh right, we were reading a paper. Right.
At one point.
Nah, true.
Actually, really quick question. Do you know of good resources for building NLP tools for low resource languages?
Yes. So I'm currently investigating something called a byte pair embedding. They're pre-trained embeddings that I think 270 languages or so, and they're like fast text, but instead of taking all the subwords out there, they take a subset of all the subwords and only train embeddings on those. So if you have the word astronomer, then the astro part says something, the onomer says something, and the idea behind this model is that they only sort of train a few of these subwords, still cover a lot of ground. Language models that are megabytes instead of gigabytes, byte pair. That's still work in progress, but it's something to look to. Yeah. They're pretty cool.
I would say my general advice for people who are working on lower resource languages is just ignore all the big deep learning approaches, because if you don't have a lot of training data, they're just not going to work well for you, and also they're expensive. So I would say look at sort of the more vintage NLP approaches, like tokenization and sort of like you're probably going to need stop words.
Count vectors still work fine. That's certainly true.
Yeah,
that's certainly true.
Depending on your pre-processing. So if you have a very like agglutinative language that has like really rich morphology, or say
you can do the n-gram tricks or something. There's usually still some tricks in the bags there, let's say.
Yes, absolutely. I would say look at NLP papers from, I don't know, the 90s would be my recommendation to look at sort of methods that were designed for people that didn't have, gigabytes of data and also like compute budgets.
And also I think a thing I just want to mention here, I suppose, like I run some benchmarks sometimes. It's not always the case that adding word embeddings makes the model better. I've actually seen sometimes that adding word embeddings makes the model worse. Because what the language model, the word embeddings are trained on might not be the chatbot setting that you're using. So sometimes it's also just completely fine to start with the most basic thing you've got and use that as a benchmark to move forward. You often don't need to upgrade. That's also a lesson.
Yeah. So it looks like, just sort of like skimming through this, the sentiment of words associated with Asian was very high. The sentiment of words associated with Black was very low. And they're suggesting that some of that might be due to the association of Black and slavery and sort of the history there. Yeah, so it looks like Asian is this top line. Black is this bottom line, white is this sort of middle line that's right around neutral. This very spiky line that is red is Latinx, and then this purple line is Indian, and this brown line here is Middle Eastern. I'm tracing them because using just color to distinguish between lines is not very helpful for some people.
Yeah. But okay, they definitely. So this is a table that I think is going to be referred to later. But the main thing I'm getting here is that they do fill in the blank types of tasks, and then they show that if you fill in the blanks, that you do get some stereotypes back, or definitely things you don't want to have, because this is just biased. That's the main thing.
And given that 0 here is neutral, I think the most striking from this is that there's a lot of anti-Blackness.
Yeah, and I think that you should not blame all of this. Was trained on was Wikipedia also part of this?
I mean, it's Common Crawl.
Yeah, so that includes Wikipedia, right?
It also includes other stuff that I would expect to have.
So there's probably some forums and stuff in here as well. But let me put it. I'd be hard pressed to be convinced. Like I wouldn't be convinced if people said, "Oh, this is because of the few mentions of slavery articles on Wikipedia." Like I think there's probably more bias in the data than just that.
So they have this table about most favorite descriptive words for gender and religion, but not for race.
I'm assuming this is, well, I don't know if you should call this cherry picking, but I think that they went for religion here because there is this, because it's an easy example to show, possibly. So that I think and I can imagine that, like you go for if you can demonstrate the obvious examples that they're still going wrong in your data set, then you can still say, it's biased. So, I still think I do agree that religion is a bit of an odd choice. That's true, but
it is.
But looking here, if I look at, for example, if you see Islam and then there's terrorism, then you immediately go, okay, right, that's like bias.
No, I don't think it's not important to look at. It's just, I think probably for me, it's not the third thing I would have picked. Also, so the interesting thing is that they're arguing that the anti-blackness might be related to words related to slavery. They have these tables with the key term and the most related terms for the other two demographic things they use, but not for race. So they don't really provide any evidence to support their argument besides we say so.
That's okay. That's okay. I get what you're saying there. I think that's a fair statement. Yeah.
Especially since they clearly had the code to do it.
Yeah.
Before and after. Interesting. And that's all they talk about. And religion. Do they talk about why?
Let's just have a quick scroll.
Yeah. No. They're just like, and we did religion. Huh.
To be honest, though, I think if you wanted to do this model and just all the biases that you can find for religion, that alone could be like a multi-page article, right? So
absolutely.
I also understand that they have to reduce the size of description here.
Yeah, no fair. I mean, why? Why do they have to reduce this? There's no art journal that they're submitting to this to that I know about. I mean, it's 74 pages.
Well, with appendix and whatnot, so yeah.
No, that's true. I'm just saying that any length restrictions here are entirely self-imposed. Do you want to read the future ethics section and then
yes,
call it a...
Yeah, we need to...
I think at this point the video's getting a little long.
Yeah, we got to start wrapping up as well.
And also Sandeep says includes Reddit, which has a lot more biases.
Reddit can be a source of frustrating comments. This is certainly true.
Yes. And they're... I don't know if you heard about this, Vincent, but they just did like a big purge of some of the most virulent hate speech related groups from Reddit.
Yeah, well, it was a couple of weeks ago, I think, right? Something like that.
Relatively recently, yeah. But it's still going to be in like historical versions of Common Crawl.
Yeah, no, like how should I say this? There used to be a time when I used to hang out on Reddit and was like, oh, all these people are super nice. And then there was a time that people started sharing my blog posts and people were still sort of nice. And then there was a time when people started sharing my blog posts and they weren't nice at all. And I've stopped reading what people say about my blog posts when they share now. Bummer, but it's...
And I know there's some fantastic Reddit communities, but unfortunately there's some ones that are absolutely participating in completely unacceptable behavior.
Yeah, and it just sort of seeps over. So I found Twitter remarkably to be kind of easier for me to bubble in. But anyway... So I'm quickly glancing over the future bias, just sort of what's in here, so we can also just have a quick look at energy usage, but because we have to start wrapping up. We have presented this preliminary analysis to share that some of the bias we found motivate further research and to align inherent difficulties in characterizing biases in large-scale generative models. Yeah, so I think the main thing that they say here is, yes, we have bias. What it does say, we chose gender, race, and religion as a starting point, but recognize the inherent subjectivity in this choice. Our work is inspired by literature on characterizing model attributes to develop informative labels, such as model cards for model reporting. So they have found an article that they refer to with the main reason why they chose these axes.
Yeah, also model cards is a great paper. I recommend it.
I have not read it, so I'll definitely keep it.
Oh, you should. It's about like what information should you share along with a model.
Yeah, that's indeed a topic.
It's like that thing from you know, the engineering thing where like when you get like a motherboard or something, there's like a specification model. It's like here's all the stuff in it and like the choices we made and whatever.
Oh, okay. So it's okay. It's different than the Dion checklist, but definitely something.
Yes.
It's always good to hear what people think about these things.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it is important not just to characterize biases, but to intervene. The literature on this is also extensive, so we offer only a few, only a brief comments, okay, on future directions. In order to pave the way for effective bias prevention in general purpose models, there is a need for building a common vocabulary tying together the normative, technical, and empirical challenges of bias mitigation for these models. Okay. There is room for more research that engages with the literature outside of NLP, better articulates normative statements about harm, and engages with the live experience of communities affected by NLP systems. Thus, mitigation should not be approached purely as with a metric-driven objective to remove bias, as it has been shown to have blind spots, but in a holistic manner.
Yeah, definitely.
I agree. It's a bit of it's a bit blah blah, but it is true.
Oh, I thought there was going to be a section on like mitigation efforts. There isn't.
No,
They're just like, we know it exists.
Yeah, and a couple of articles. So that's okay. So I guess like the final thing I just quickly want to glance over, just energy use, because
and also just to like, I will say I think this is the first paper I've seen that talks about bias in language models and ways to evaluate it. So that's definitely a contribution. It does feel like a little bit weaselly to be like, oh, there's problems. Well, we'll leave that to somebody else to work on.
Considering the appendix is all about sort of how good is the model, you can make a similar appendix with the same size on this, and you can add that to the appendix. I don't know if it wasn't mentioned anywhere that they added that in the appendix, but I guess the main thing this also comes down to is sort of just the petaflops days for this model.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So I'll just start reading from the second paragraph because I think that's where they start. Oh, that's the beginning. Practical large-scale pre-training techniques require large amounts of computation, which is energy intensive. Training this model consumed several thousand petaflops days of compute during pre-training, compared to tens of petaflops days for the 1.5 parameter model. This means that we should be cognizant of the cost and efficiency of such models, as advocated by other paper. The use of large-scale pre-training also gives another lens through which to view the efficiency of large models. We consider it not only the resources that go into training them, but how these resources are amortized over the lifetime of a model, which will sequentially be used for a variety of purposes. And though models like GPT-2 consume significant resources during training, they can be surprisingly efficient once trained. Even with the full GPT-2, yes, generating 100 pages of content from a trained model can cost in the order of 0.4 kilowatt hours, or only a few cents in energy cost. Additionally, techniques like model distillation can further bring down the cost of such models, letting us adopt a paradigm of training single large-scale models and then creating more efficient versions of them in the appropriate context. Algorithmic processes will also okay. Not really commenting there.
Yep.
Bit disappointing.
Yeah, I guess I'm glad I'm happy that the authors are discussing
they're mentioning
how their work fits in this largest content. You have energy usage. They haven't released the GPT-3 model though. They only have API access, which is good because hopefully they're very actively mitigating harm, but also hard. But I guess the second question is, since GPT-2 existed and was still doing an okay job, why do we need GPT-3?
Yeah. And this also falls into the picture of marginal returns at some point, right? And that's something I was hoping to see here.
Yeah. Because I think the big thing that they argue throughout the paper is that the bigger model is genuinely doing better on these tasks they made up, which I guess is good, but is it? I don't know. Like I'm not gonna put this into production. Even if I had the model, I would probably not use it. I would use something smaller.
Yeah. Nah. So to me, okay. So let's put a summary to this. So I think definitely it's cool that they added this ethics section and they mentioned some of these things.
Definitely. I'm glad they're talking about it.
Yeah. So and that's certainly valid. I will say it's a little bit. I think some of the examples they gave clearly indicate yes, there's bias. Like they definitely demonstrate that. And I thought their choices were a little bit odd at times, but they do refer to articles, so just assume there's a good reason
They're
for it.
definitely in discussion with the rest of the literature around this.
Yeah, so I think so far that's... I would argue, hey, they're doing their homework. The only thing I'm a little bit bummed by is I think you can do like a lot of work in that fairness, like measuring all these types of biases. And I would have assumed that if they did a lot of work there, that there would also be a part in the appendix of lots of charts about that. But I see no reference of that, which makes it feel like it's a little bit more of an afterthought than something they thought about ahead of time.
Yeah.
And again, that's suggestive. I don't know what actually was the main driver here, but...
Let's see if I can... I'm just quickly scrolling through the appendix to see if there is one that I missed. And I'll say, we definitely see evidence that they thought about ethical questions and added bias. So I added these bias evaluations, and we're like, yep, there's bias, and discussed the shortcomings in their model in their paper, which is fantastic. But I don't know how else their ethical considerations change their behavior. You know?
Yeah. So in that sense, it feels to me a bit of as an afterthought. It's not entirely fair to call it an afterthought, though. It's just by I don't have a better word for it. But it doesn't seem like fairness was the primary driver here.
No. Enrique says, perhaps there's too much bias in GPT-2 and GPT-3 comes to solve it.
There wasn't a comparison between the two.
I don't think they didn't talk about GPT-2 here, and I don't believe there was a bias analysis of GPT-2 in the original paper. It's been a while since I read it, but I'm pretty sure they didn't discuss it. Yeah, and I don't see additional discussion in the appendices of bias.
So I see another question, AIF360 for another reading session. I could be mistaken, but I believe that's the library, fairness library, that they might want to have for another reading session.
Let's see.
If it is the IBM tool, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yeah.
Which I think is I've had a look at it. It seemed like it had a couple of things that are likable. My main gripe when I first saw it was that it wasn't compatible with scikit-learn back when.
Is there something that is compatible with scikit-learn, Vincent?
I'm contributing towards a project. Yeah.
Softball.
Yeah, a bit of a softball there. So there's this project called Scikit-Lego, which offers a couple of fairness tools that I have built together with a lovely set of collaborators. Just want to give a shout out to Matthijs Bruins, because he's been adding lots of cool stuff. But we have thought about it and we figured, hey, this needs a proper package on its own. Fairness is something we take serious. So we've been looking around, like, where do we host it? And there's a collaboration now with some people who work at Microsoft called FairLearn. So what we are doing right now is we're porting some of our stuff onto there, and then it will have like a proper place where, I like to think I'm a little bit more street smarts than book smarts, but also some book smarts people will have a look and help maintain it. Definitely still in the works. I think fairness mitigation techniques in general are new-ish in the sense that people are sort of starting to take them seriously only now. But the main thing to think about when you're doing fairness mitigation techniques is if you're trying to make it more fair, that's great. But if... there's a publication for it?
Yeah, apparently.
Oh.
I'll pull up the Scikit-Lego.
Oh, okay.
Wait. Or is it Scikit Fair?
No, it's Scikit Fairness was the working title, but we've decided to move to the FairLearn. Scikit-Lego is the other project. You'll recognize the logo. But the main thing with these fairness mitigation techniques is they're all great and all that stuff. It's a good attitude to have. But if you're really worried about fairness mitigation techniques, you might want to start wondering if the thing you're building needs to be built. That's the first question you should probably ask.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Vincent.
Yep.
We've been reading the paper we've been talking about topics tangential to paper Language Models for Few-Shot Learners by Tom Brown et al. From OpenAI. I think it's a interesting engineering paper, and the other things we have to say we've said over the last two videos.
I think to conclude, one thing that is definitely fair to mention, I do think the work that they have done did, if nothing else, cause this discussion to be more at the forefront, right? I think that's one thing that the paper, in the end, also achieved.
Definitely.
So that deserves recognition, because I do think having that conversation earlier is better than later.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it's a heavy model.
It's a big one.
Big one.
Yeah, so the next reading group will be same time, Thursday at 9 a.m. Pacific, I should say. And we'll probably announce this one a little bit earlier. We were a little bit under the radar on this one on account of it was the first time we've tried it with this setup, and I think there's some growing pains. Yeah, I think I'm going to try and use the video from the Skype, not the Skype, the Zoom, so I'll have to do some futzing there. Thank you for bearing with us with our... Yeah. Also, I need to figure out how to... I need to contact...
but this is all kind of an experiment. But we like the... so far, at least on my side, I think this has been fun. I think the feedback from the YouTube has been fun, too. I also know that there's some colleagues of ours who are interested in maybe doing some more of this. Maybe also some of our researchers will pitch in here. So I hope that people like this. And if people have recommendations or ideas for, hey, could you do this paper, do let us know.
I will say we haven't mapped out the next couple, but definitely feel free to reach out if you're like, please read this one. We're happy to. Thank you for joining, everybody. We will be back next Thursday with a new paper, TBA, and we will see you then. Oh, comment from Sandeep. Thank you, Rachel and Vincent. There are a lot of paper reading videos on YouTube, but none of them have these kind of detailed and interesting discussion.
Oh, that's nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's nice. Happy to hear. Thanks.
All right. Thanks very much, Vincent. I will see you later. And I'll see you. Live long and prosper to you too.
It's a Star Trek reference. It's how I say goodbye on Zoom. Sorry. A bit of a nerdy thing. But...
We're all nerds here. I think it's okay. I'll talk to you later. Bye.